want to start out the discussion of the problems of Israel and the Arabs and the peace process by talking about the event that changed everything. That is, the event that changed all things in the Middle East was not the election of Yitzhak Rabin. In fact, his election most likely would not have taken place had this other event not occurred. The traumatic event that changed the course of world politics happened in August of 1991. And the world has not been the same since. It's called the fall of Soviet communism. Without that event, nothing else would have followed that has happened in the Middle East over the last 8 years. Over the last 8 years, all the things that have happened are due to the trigger of that collapse. Because as long as the Cold War was on, as long as the United States of America was confronting the superpower of the Soviet Union, there was no possibility of peace in the Middle East. The fall of communism, first and above all, made America the one and only superpower in the world. We are the one and only superpower in the world. There is nobody else. There are other great powers. There's China and there's Japan, certainly. And there is still Russia in a very, very crumpled form. But there's no other superpower. It is very clear now in the world that if you want to get things done, you better be on the good side of America. Now that has changed the whole political picture. That was certainly not true prior to 1991. The second thing were all these poor schleps, all these powers that had backed the Soviet Union, that had assumed, since they hated the Americans, that their future lay by allying themselves with the communist world. There were all these powers in the Middle East who chose that posture, with whom peace was not possible. Iraq, for a long time, chose the Soviet Union. Syria militantly chose the Soviet Union. Egypt, even for a short while, was allied to the Soviet Union. Libya chose the Soviet Union. And Algeria, in many ways, chose the Soviet Union. They received military aid, military guidance. And then all of a sudden, in August 1991, to their chagrin and their embarrassment, they're left high and dry. Their chief supporter is gone. In fact, the chief supporter is now trying to win the help of the United States of America. And the Soviet Union has collapsed. You can just imagine what the mood was in Damascus. They had spent almost 40 years investing in that Soviet alliance. And now, nothing. And the same thing was true all over the Arab world and the Muslim world. The third was it affected the whole thinking economically. Something called the market economy now became the thing all over the world, because the market economy was attached to the United States of America. Socialism was attached to the idea of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was gone. Communism was now bankrupt. Most of the countries in the Arab world and in the Muslim world had tried military socialism, socialism administered by soldiers. And every case resulted in economic disaster. But so long as the Soviet Union was there to support the disaster, then that was all right. But now it was very clear there would have to be economic changes, and that affected not only the Arab allies of the Soviet Union, it also affected Israel. After all, the powerful party in Israel for the first 25 years of its existence was the Labor Party, the Socialist Party. And the founders of that party had been deeply married to the ideas of collectivism and socialism. Over the years, they had lost their socialist fervor, in particular because the Soviet Union was so hostile to the state of Israel. But this was the final blow. I mean, this was it. And now even Israel had to respond to the reality that most likely socialism was on its way out, and by 1991, the kibbutz movement in Israel, which was one of its more successful socialist experiments, was undergoing a major, major transformation. And the fall of communism simply altered the confrontations in the Near East. I choose to use the word Near East because I refuse to give it up. There's far, middle, and near. Middle is Iran, got it? And Afghanistan, that's the Middle East. The Near East is what we call Western Asia. The Near East is Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, to some degree Turkey, and Egypt. So it affected the whole fortune of the Near East. Now let me just try to talk about the Near East as it existed at the time of the fall of communism. We're going back 8 years, a very critical moment in the history of the 20th century. The Near East was mainly occupied by a people called the Arabs. And almost all the Arabs, not all the Arabs, but almost all the Arabs were part of a religious world which was broader than the Near East and broader than the Arab world. That was the world of Islam, or the Muslim world. In the Near East, going all the way back to 1936, a hot war had been fought. That is, the war between the Jews and the Arabs did not begin in 1948 when Israel became independent. It had been going on already as a hot war since 1936, since a major rebellion on the part of the Arabs against the British in Palestine and against the Jewish settlers. The War of Independence was just a part of that war. So since 1936, the major conflict in the area was a war between the Zionist state and not simply the people, the Arabs who lived in Palestine, but with the Arab world. If it were only with the Arabs who lived in Palestine, it would have been a war taken care of, right? It was with the Arab world. The Near East in 1991 was clearly divided into those countries that were pro-American and those countries that were pro-Soviet or pro-Russian. That's it. So it was very clear. Iraq had been pro-Russian, although it was trying to play both sides of the fence. Syria was pro-Russian. Lebanon, in order to preserve itself, had been basically pro-American. Saudi Arabia, pro-American. Jordan, pro-American. Israel, well, Israel was pro-American and very, very fanatically so. In fact, Israeli security during this period of time during the Cold War depended on the alliance with the United States of America, and the United States of America was strongly attached to Israel. One of the reasons was they viewed Israel as the major bulwark in the Middle East against the Soviet Union. And that's how Israel and its army presented itself to the United States government. Egypt, well, Egypt had started out under Nasser as pro-Russian. But then in 1977 and 78, when the peace process between Egypt and Israel began, it was a very clear sign that Sadat was shifting from what? One side to the other, from the Russians and the Soviets to the Americans. So there was this very clear division. In addition, the Near East was divided up into states with boundaries that were created by European colonial powers. I mean, there wasn't a state called the Arab state. The French had come up and carved out Syria. The British had come up and carved out Iraq. The British had come and carved Jordan. Egypt itself, the boundaries of Egypt had been determined by the British. So this world was divided up by boundaries which did not necessarily correspond to real divisions within the Arab world, but to lines drawn by colonial powers. And in some cases, they were not realistic boundaries, but there they were. Now, when communism fell, it had a very profound effect on the Arab world. So let's just look at it, because we're talking about 1991 till now. Just this last 8-year period, it's been tremendous. The first thing it allowed was the crushing of Iraq. Had the Soviet Union been a superpower allied with Iraq, would they have allowed the Americans to invade Iraq? Never. The Russians were humiliated. Their economic and military power was basically humiliated. The Americans moved in. Iraq was crushed, and even though Saddam Hussein remained in power, the country is now under embargo and boycott. Libya, look what's happened to Libya. Have you been reading about Colonel Gaddafi? Oh. Colonel Gaddafi used to breathe fire against the Americans. But after the fall of communism, even Gaddafi, who's slightly crazy, realized that he could not ultimately function without some level of cooperation with the Americans. And now butter would melt in his mouth. He's decided to open a new chapter in his life. He's decided maybe to turn over the people who may have been guilty for the Lockerbie disaster, plane disaster, over to the international authorities. He now wants to make up with the United States of America. He now speaks very, very softly. He's entered a whole new phase, and that whole new phase was not brought about by his psychiatrist. That whole new phase was brought about by the fact that his chief ally is gone. Sudan, which is south of Egypt, one of the most provocative states in the Arab world, anti-American. Well, now Sudan is quieting down. There is no alternative to dealing with the international order controlled by the United States of America. There's no alternative. There's no place else to go. Maybe Mars, I don't know. But there's no other place to go. Syria. Do you remember how hateful Assad was? hated the Americans, hated the Israelis. Oh, thing. Now in Damascus. Hi. The American ambassador walks in. Hi. Madeleine Albright comes. Kiss, 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 kiss. Did he simply fall in love with Madeleine Albright? I mean, was that what happened to him? I mean, all he saw her and he said, woo! Or does he now realize on which side his bread is buttered? And that was very clear during the Iraq War. Syria became an ally of the United States of America. And Syria is the last major Arab power that Israel has to make peace with. It's on the borders of Israel. Egypt, peace. Peace with Jordan followed the fall of communism in 1993. And Syria, nobody thought it was possible. This man hated the Israelis, hated the Americans, vowed he would carry on the Muslim crusade, if such a phrase can be used. All right. Isn't it amazing how people change when their vested interests change? Even happens in our personal lives. One of the consequences was the religionization, it's my words, sorry. It's the religionization of politics. Once the Soviet Union left, those people who wanted to continue the militant war against Israel had to find another source for it. And that other source was something that had existed all along, but now came to the fore as the major resistance to the Americans, right? The major anti-American force now in the Arab world was no longer the allies of the Soviet Union. Who was an ally of the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union didn't exist. The new major force was fundamentalism, right? So the forces of extreme religion or fanatic religion now moved in to take that place. If you still wanted to hate Israelis and hate Americans and whatever else it is, you no longer use the vocabulary of the Cold War, which happened to be secular. You now use the vocabulary of religion. And in fact, fundamentalist forces grew in strength and power during this period of time because they replaced the old forces who were allied to the Soviet Union, and they were left what? High and dry, gone. One of the effects, obviously, was the rise of fundamentalism in two countries. During the past 8 years, the most terrible civil war broke out in Algeria. And in fact, the military government that had been allied in some way to the Russians, the military government that had been secular, was now confronted by these fundamentalists who said, you failed. We all hate the Americans, but you allied yourself with Russia. And look what you got. Nothing. I'll tell you who we're allied with. Allah. And he's not going to let us down the way those Russians did. So, and then the same thing happened to Mubarak in Egypt, the rise of fundamentalist forces. We felt part of that rise in Egypt in America by a terrorist act that occurred in New York at the World Trade Center. So it was now spreading out. So now the anti-Israeli forces, the anti-American forces, had to redefine themselves around a new issue. They shifted from this pro-Soviet stance to fundamentalism now took over. One of the consequences was that the Arab world was finally open to the prospect of peace. Since Israel was viewed as the ally of the United States of America, and America was viewed as the hegemonic power in the world, It was obviously now foolish to imagine that you could destroy Israel. Israel was here to stay because America was here to stay. Right? So long as you had the Soviet superpower confronting America, maybe there was a chance, but not now. So now all over the Arab world, even in Damascus and Algiers and so forth, people were saying, well, we hate it, we don't like it, but she's here to stay. She's here to stay because America is here to stay, and America is the hegemonic power in the world. It's like resignation. Sometimes you simply realize what? You got to accept it. And the fall of communism was the trigger for that. Had communism not fallen, the Arab world would not have perceived the necessity for peace. And the last thing was, all the Arabs are now running to Washington. They're all showing up. They need this, they need this, they need that. They're negotiating the whole thing. And they're now offering to the United States of America something that Israel was not totally happy about. Because part of the power of Israel was that she was the only power in the Middle East that the United States of America, or the Near East, could really depend on. But now all these Arab powers are running to Washington and saying, well, if you make us your ally, we'll help you. That makes Israel less significant or important. Although it makes peace more likely, it reduces the importance of Israel in terms of America, because now America says, we're the hegemonic power, and now what we're going to do is we'll control the Near East. In order to control the Near East, we'll become friends with all the Arab powers. And in order to make friends with all the Arab powers, we will force Israel to make peace also. Oh. And that happened in the Bush administration. So it isn't necessarily true that because the allies of the Soviet Union were humiliated, that it was an entire win for Israel. On the contrary, it now opened up a whole new series of friends for America and enabled America to redefine its foreign policy, which was now to embrace as many of the powers in that Arab Muslim world as possible. What was the effect on Israel? Well, the effect on Israel, that's how Rabin got elected. Rabin got elected because it was very clear to many people in Israel that they would have to make peace. Because now the agenda of the United States of America was to reconcile itself with all the Arab powers. Well, so the Israelis had to face something. Even Israelis who said, we're not going to give the 1 inch. They now had to accept the fact that Mr. Baker, who was the Secretary of State, kept what? Pressuring them. They had to accept the fact that they would have to yield to. And Rabin's election in 1992 was the consequence of that. And the whole opening to peace. Rabin shaking hands with Arafat. Rabin shaking hands with Hussein of Jordan. All of that followed the fall of communism. Israel, too, was forced to enter into the peace process. That didn't mean that there were not people who wanted peace before. It simply meant it was the push. It was very clear that America, who was the hegemonic power, wanted it. One of the things that happened as a result of the Soviet collapse was that thousands and several 100,000 Russian Jews left the Soviet Union and came to Israel. Very important constituency. There is now in Israel almost 1 million Russian Jews. They have changed the whole demographic picture of Israel. In Israel, there are close to 5 million Jews, and there are approximately 1 million Palestinians or Arabs. Of the 5 million now, 20% are Russians. There is a fourth language in Israel now. You see it in the signs. There were 3 before. There was Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Signs were in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Now, everywhere you go, there are Russian newspapers, Russian signs, the whole thing. Now, many of those people arrived before the fall of communism. They started leaving in the 1970s, and they came to Israel. So there was a substantial number of them prior to the fall of communism. But after 1991, there was this huge what? Outflow, and it was at that time that the United States of America closed its doors to further immigration, mass immigration from Russia. So these people, many of whom would have preferred to come to America, now ended up in Israel, and they are a new constituency. The fall of communism brought all these people to Israel, and they vote. Now, most of these people are secular. Most of these people are attached to families where there has been a great deal of intermarriage, because that's the result of living under communism for 75 years. So the consequence for Israel has been enormous. It killed socialism. That is, if the Labor Party had been socialist, it's gone. As you know, in the election that was held in May of 1999, this year, the Labor Party changed its name. It no longer uses the word labor. The phrase is One Israel. That's what it's called. It's trying to change its entire image. I'm sure Tony Blair in England wouldn't mind changing the title of the party from Labour to something else, because he's abandoned socialism and he's trying to reach the middle class, and the word labor is not a good word to use if you want to reach the middle class. But in Israel, they changed it. One Israel. The consequence for Israel of the fall of communism was not only that America reconciled itself with its Arab enemies, but it also meant that now there was continuous pressure from Washington, whether it was Republican or Democratic, to make peace. It is the vested interest of the United States of America, who now manages the global economy, to see that there's law and order. And the latest one is we got the Australians to go into where? East Timor. We're managing this whole thing, and so there's got to be peace, and that's it. One of the consequences was that the Israeli government now had to confront a reality that they didn't do before. Israeli governments never spoke of Palestinians. They always spoke of Arabs living in Israel, whatever else it is. Once communism fell, once the peace process began, suddenly a new Arab nation was being recognized by Israel. All of us, Rabin used the word, right? You had to use the word. You had to say, aha, yeah, that's, say it slowly, Yitzchak. Palestinian. And maybe a country called Palestine. One of the consequences of the fall of communism and what I call the death of socialism is, and you see it in Israel, young people are searching for some kind of ideology. The consumer culture is not entirely satisfying for them. Some find it in fundamentalist religion. We have the same experience here in the United States of America. And now you can't find Israeli young people. You go to India. They're all there. Guru X, Guru Y, Guru Z, whatever. You can't imagine the transformation of the Israeli public, where 50 years ago young Israelis were saying, on to the revolution, we're going to the kibbutz, we're going to the farm, the whole thing. Now they got beads. And they do yoga, and they meditate. You know, it's no. It's radically altering. When I was in India 2 years ago, I ran into like hordes of Israeli tourists. They're all over the place, searching. It's like a mirror, searching. It's one of the things that happens when you suddenly have a consumer culture. You're searching. Got the change? And certainly the fall of communism enhanced that. Well, so the peace process is triggered by the fall of communism. But the peace process is filled with problems. First of all, a good part of the Israeli world and the Arab world are ambivalent about the whole thing. They're not quite sure, the Arabs or the Palestinians, that they want Israel to exist. And there are certainly thousands of Israelis who do not wish to give up any inch of the occupied territory because they see their security endangered. There was a very strong Arab opposition, not simply ambivalent. They were fueled by the fundamentalists. There is a party in the Palestinian world called the Hamas Party. Still very strong and very powerful, and they are totally opposed to the peace process. And they spoke out against Arafat. And there's a Jewish opposition that arose, fueled by the same fundamentalism. In many cases, they were ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel who said that God gave us this land and we will not give up any. And they now constituted a very, very aggressive opposition. One of them killed Yitzhak Rabin. One of the problems, obviously, major one, during the period of time between 1977 and the fall of communism in 1991, the Israeli government was mainly in the hands of a conservative party called Likud, the leader of which was Menachem Begin, who was then replaced by Yitzhak Shamir. And one of the things they invested public money in was establishing all over the West Bank, all over the occupied territories, Jewish settlements. So now there are 150,000 Jews, and they're living in Palestinian territory. They say it's not Palestinian. They say it's what? Israeli. So now you say, well, we're going to negotiate and we're going to give this territory up. And they say, look, we're here. We live here. This is our home. What do you mean you're going to negotiate giving this place up? Jews live here. And we have votes. So I want you to put us on television. I want you to show the Israeli people, the Israeli army coming into our settlement and dragging old people out of their houses, throwing them into trucks, and driving them off. You do it. Well, don't get excited. Who's giving up any settlements? No. We wouldn't want to do that. That happened once. Menachem Begin consented. When they gave up Sinai, there was a settlement called Yamit, and the people didn't want to leave. And I remember on television, it was terrible. Begin didn't know what to do. They had to bring in the Israeli army to what? Forcibly remove many of the people who were hanging on to the pillars. They were not going to leave. It's the worst thing. One of the problems, obviously, were prisoners. In Israeli jail, there were thousands and thousands of people who were viewed by the Israelis as criminals because they had either killed Israelis or wounded them, or tried to wound them, or kill them. But the Palestinians viewed them as heroes. They saw themselves as political prisoners. They were like the Jews under the British who blew up the King David Hotel. They didn't think that was a crime. They thought that was what? Fighting for the people. Well, can you take all those prisoners, thousands of them, who were convicted of crimes against Israelis, and there are hundreds of Israeli families who are mourning their dead? Are you going to take them and turn them over to just release them? Look what happened in America. Hillary may not become the senator from New York. She opened her mouth on Puerto Rican. Do you remember that whole issue? Pardoning those people. And Bill Clinton is in trouble. And then you have another problem. There are close to 3 million Palestinian refugees, all of whom claim they have a right to return. So now you say, okay, this is your piece of land. Well, the piece of land can maybe accommodate 1.5 million people. It can't accommodate what? 4.5 million. So now the refugees pour in. All that means is you're going to have another war. Can you allow the refugees to return? And one of the problems, and very clear, was that while the President of the United States was pressuring Israel to make peace, the leaders in the Congress were not. Because the leaders in the Congress were always tuned into their constituencies. And many of these constituencies had very strong and powerful Jewish votes. So now it's very clear what the problem is. If you are opposed to the peace process and to the pressure being applied by the American government, you then go to Congress and you try to have Congress apply pressure on the president to change his mind. It's a problem still going on. One of the problems obviously was all you need is somebody with a bomb. They walk into a shopping center in Jerusalem, they leave the bomb goes off, the bomb kills 5 people, and what? The peace process is off. How can we have peace with terrorists? And you're always sitting on the edge, which you never know when they're going to act. You don't need armies of people. All you need are 5 fanatics cooperating with each other. One of the major problems was the person of Yasser Arafat, who with the Israeli public is often viewed as a little sleazy, and therefore dealing with him, how can you trust him after all that he did and whatever else it is? The propaganda of the earlier years has affected Israeli public opinion. But the worst problem was that Rabin was assassinated. And when the election was held ultimately to replace him, his party's candidate did not win. And into power came a leader who had said he was opposed to the peace process. His name, Bibi Netanyahu, and we've had him around for the last 3.5 years. So let me talk about Netanyahu. Netanyahu arrives in power. He's the cog in the wheel, right? Trying to get this peace process on. So he comes in. And what he wants to do is to stop it. So let me show you his tactics. They happened over the last 3.5 years. He could never say he was opposed as the leader of Israel to implementing the peace process because Israel had signed the treaty, and the President of the United States, who supplied him with aid and money, whatever else it is, was committed to it. So he said, yes, I don't like it, but what? I keep my word. So, strategy one. Bibi, we're having a meeting this morning about discussing withdrawal from Area 6. Oh, I have such a headache. Such a headache. I can't make the meeting. Next day, Bibi, we have a meeting for Area, you understand? The whole thing is delay. The second thing was he gave money to more and more settlements. More and more settlements. 3, and this was his clever thing, he came to America, and the first thing he did was not to visit President Clinton. The first thing he did was to visit Congress. He was seen with the leaders of Congress, and the leaders of Congress, the Republican leaders of Congress, and some of the Democratic leaders stood up in public standing next to him and say, it's a shame, all this pressure that's being brought on the state of Israel by the American government. That isn't what the American people wants. It's a very good strategy. One of the things he did was he's totally secular, not religious at all. He started putting on yarmulkes. And he started visiting rabbinic seminaries, yeshivas, and all of a sudden he's making friends with the Orthodox. He wants to garner as much Orthodox support in Israel as possible. And then come the provocations. He doesn't say they're provocations. What he decides to do is to build a housing project on the road between Bethlehem and the rest of the West Bank, which would effectively mean that under no circumstance could the Palestinians use Jerusalem effectively as a capital. It's the Har Choma, it's called. And this apartment development is being put up, and everybody's screaming, you're ruining the peace process. And he said, we're not ruining the peace process. I'm just putting up an apartment development. It's a little of them. It would mean they'd have to go maybe 100 miles out of their way to get, it's not. What are you complaining about? And then are his demands. Every time somebody says, it's time to withdraw, Bibi says, look, I intend to withdraw. But I know that there are terrorists among the Palestinians, and until the Palestinians get rid of all their terrorists, I'm not giving up 1 inch. Well, that's like saying, I'm not giving up my gun until you take guns away from all the people in America who have them. Oh. Which means you never have to give them up. And then he had 2 other things. He then says, who needs to make peace with the Arabs? He runs to Turkey, and all of a sudden he makes this big alliance with the military leaders in Turkey, and now the military leaders in Turkey, who are afraid of fundamentalists in their country, kiss with Netanyahu. Netanyahu says, don't worry. Don't worry about Syria. Who has to make peace with Syria? Who has to make peace with Syria? The Syrians are afraid of the Turks. If we have Turkey on our side, we don't have to worry at all. And then, the final blow is he knows the Russians are having trouble with Muslims in their country, right? I talked about it last week. Dagestan, Chechnya, they're blowing apartment buildings up, Moscow, and whatever else it is. Well, Russians don't like Muslims, and what? Israelis don't like Muslims, so now we have a what? An alliance. And he sends Arik Sharon, the minister of defense, he sends Arik Sharon to Moscow. And now they're talking. How do we join together our forces in resisting Muslim? Can you believe this whole thing? He's got so many things up his sleeve. But it all failed. Netanyahu lost heavily in May of 1997. He lost because his government was hopelessly corrupt. He lost because the party of which he was the leader did not support him. because he had stolen the leadership back in 1995 and 96 from people who had wanted it and worked very hard for it. He failed because the economy took a downturn, because now the Muslim world proved more hostile and the Arab world, opportunities for economic connections began to fade. He failed because Arafat didn't bite the bait. What Netanyahu wanted to do was to infuriate Arafat, to the point where Arafat would get up and say, what? Finished! This peace process is over. The terrorists, let them go. That's what he wanted. Now, whether Arafat took pills, I don't know. Once in a while he slipped, but on the whole, he kept his cool. Had Arafat lost his cool, that was Netanyahu's program, to provoke him to the point where he would lose his cool, and that would end the peace process. But Arafat held. One of the reasons why he failed was Israel can't survive without the support and help of the United States of America. You can run to Moscow all you want. What Yeltsin has to give you is only laundered money in a New York bank. So, if America says you better make peace, Bibi, you better make peace, Bibi. Finally, toward the end, just before he lost his power, he was dragged into Maryland to a place called Y. And there was Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton would let him go to the bathroom. Couldn't even go to the bathroom. He had him sit down there, and he said, you sign this thing, you're going to withdraw from the West Bank, you're going to do it, you're going to do it, you're going to do it. And he what? Bibi, who has a very strong will and strong mind, in the end was compelled to sign the Y agreement. And the other thing, and the most important thing, you know, people often say, well, I don't like this. I don't like this, and I don't like that, and I don't like this. So what do you like? You know, it's like the problem with the market economy. People say, well, there's this problem, this problem, this problem. Well, now with the death of socialism, the question always is, so, yes, it has all these problems, but what's the alternative? So the question to Netanyahu was, for which he had no answer. So now we have all this delaying process, and we anger the Palestinians, and we anger the Arabs, and we anger Mubarak of Egypt, and we anger Hussein of Jordan. We anger them all. Where are you going? What will happen? And the answer is, he had no alternative. I mean, you understand? It's like petulance. What in the end will you do? Can Israel stand alone without American help and American assistance against an Arab world that has now established some kind of an alliance with the United States of America? I mean, what's your strategy, Bibi? So, out of that came an election. And in that election, there were various issues. The primary issue of the election, which was held on May 17th, was the issue of peace. But there were other issues that were also attached to the election. There was the issue of the power of the Orthodox in Israeli life. And they were also influential in determining the battle against the peace process. There was the issue of the economy, which wasn't doing that well. There was the issue of the establishment. One of the ways that Bibi Netanyahu came to power was he said, I hate all those people in the Labor Party who governed this country for over 30 years and who abused Oriental and Sephardic Jews and who didn't pay any attention to all the people who didn't belong to their group, that Ashkenazic group that came from Eastern Europe. Even though he was what? Ashkenazic, and his family came from Eastern Europe. I hate all those people, and I'm your champion against them. Now, in Israel, there are lots and lots of people who hate the old establishment. The old establishment are those people descended from the people who came over between 1902 and 1948. And those people who came over from 1949 on found it hard to penetrate the power that was held by these people, their children and their grandchildren, and Bibi Netanyahu always attacked the establishment, and he still used that as a vehicle for trying to win the election in May. There was the whole issue of welfare. As the market economy was developing, the welfare system was beginning to shrink in Israel, and the Labor Party wasn't even defending the welfare system. There was the issue of America. There were people who said, we can go it alone. Let's resist the pressure. And then there was the whole issue of personality. Did you like Bibi's personality or didn't you like it? Now, the constituencies that you had to win in that election are still there. In fact, Mr. Barak, who won the election, has to work with them. There's the old establishment. There are the Sephardic and Oriental Jews who came after 1949. There is the Orthodox constituency, 15% of the population. There is now a militant group of secularists who hate Orthodox power. And they constitute somewhere around 15% of the population as well. And then there are the Russian Jews, 1 million of them. What's their grievance? Well, you have to understand. On the one hand, when they came over, the establishment didn't pay any attention to them and didn't provide them with jobs. On the other hand, they don't like the Orthodox because the Orthodox often do not regard them as Jews because their mothers may not have been Jewish, or their wives are not Jewish, or their husbands are not Jewish. I mean, there's all this problem. And one of the constituencies, obviously, there are 1 million Arabs in Israel that have the vote. You know, for a long while in America, we ignored the blacks, didn't we? The black vote meant what? Nothing. But they vote. If you can mobilize them to vote, that's 20% of the vote. Well, who were the contenders? Well, there were 2 elections held in May. One was for prime minister, and there were 5 contenders, but 2 major ones. One was Bibi Netanyahu, and the main opponent was the man from the party called One Israel, formerly called Labor. His name was Ehud Barak, a former chief of staff of the Israeli army. And then there were all these political parties. And these political parties simply reflected the vested interests of the constituencies that I outlined. On May 17th, 1999, the election was held. The main election was for the prime minister. The election for the prime minister in Israel now is like an election for the president of the United States. And once the prime minister is elected, he has to turn to the Knesset, the parliament, and try to organize a government out of it. He has to find at least 61 members of that Knesset who will support his government. So, here comes Barak. Now, Barak won. And how did he win? Well, he put together an interesting coalition. Peaceniks, Americans, because Barak always said in the election, the Americans are on what? My side, they want peace, I want peace. Militant secularists, because he said, we're going to cut the power of the Orthodox here in Israel. They have too much power. Russian Jews, when he said, look, you're right. The religious have too much power. You're Jewish, and we're going to make sure that what? You are accepted, and if we made some mistakes in the past by not giving you jobs, look, we're going to help you now. The Arabs, he said to the Arabs, you may not like us, but we're better than what? Netanyahu. And then Netanyahu had so many enemies who split from the party. There was a man called Yitzhak Mordechai, his former minister of defense. And Mordechai left and organized his own party. And in the end, just before the election, Yitzhak Mordechai, who wanted to be prime minister, said, I'm not going to win. Vote for Barak. And now he becomes prime minister. He's been prime minister since May. And from the moment he became prime minister, he had a series of challenges. They're the ones he has right now. They're there. Not a lot has happened, by the way, between May and now. There's been much change? No. Everybody's sort of sitting there. So the first challenge is when he got elected and Netanyahu was defeated, people said, aha, the peace process of Yitzhak Rabin will be what? Revived. So now there's all this expectation. Except nothing has anything happened? Not very much. One of the challenges was implementing the Y agreement. The Y agreement meant that Israel would have to withdraw from 7% more of the territory of the West Bank. But Barak said, before we can start any more withdrawals, what we have to do is sit down, he said it to Arafat, and try to figure out the final boundaries. Because just withdrawing piecemeal like this isn't going to work. We have to figure out what the final picture. And Arafat said, that's a trick. Before we'll sit down and talk to you about the final boundaries, you give us that 7%. And Barak said, no. And Arafat said, yes. And Barak said, no. Let's discuss the final settlement. And Arafat said, no, it's a trick. We are not going to do this anymore. You're going to give us that 7% of land. That's a sign of goodwill. You'll do it or that's it. And just recently, Barak said, okay. But this whole thing is a challenge. One of the challenges is the final settlement. You see, what Arafat says is, oh, good. You give us back all the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza. We have Gaza. Now we want the whole West Bank back. But Barak says, wait a minute. We can't give you the whole West Bank. First of all, we've got this little piece of land sticking into Israel here. We can't give you that back. We have to take that. And Jerusalem, well, we can't give you back East, it's our capital. Oh, can't give you that back. And over here, we have a big, big settlement, Ma'ale Adumim, and there are thousands of Israelis living there. We can't give you that back either. And there's the Jordan Valley, which lies between Jordan and us, and we can't give that back to you because that's our security. So the Palestinians are saying, you can't give this back, you can't give that back, you can't give this back, you can't give this. What's left that we're going to have? I mean, the only thing they now have in the West Bank of any economic significance is a casino. One of the challenges is very clear. If you're going to have peace with the Arab world, you're going to have to make peace with Syria. In order to get peace with Syria, you're going to have to give up a piece of territory conquered in 1967. It's called the Golan Heights. And Assad of Syria says, Rabin said to me that if I make peace with Israel, he'll give the Golan Heights to me. Well, anybody who's been a tourist to Israel, they take you up to the Golan Heights. And they show you that if the Golan Heights goes into the hands of the enemy, they'll just shoot down into the valley. So there it is. One of his problems is maintaining friendship with Jordan and Egypt. Because Jordan and Egypt are now saying, our governments are compromised by the fact we've made peace with you and you're not doing anything. One of the problems is that Ehud Barak is a military man. Rabin was too. But Barak, and you can tell from his personality, is very cautious. So one part of him says, that's right, well, we're going to do this peace process, we're going to get it over with, we're going to get it over with. And the other part of him says, Ehud, are you going to be responsible for compromising the security of the state of Israel? And you can see from his behavior that it's what? There it is. And the last challenge is, he's elected with 57% of the vote. He now has a parliament, however, in which 57% of the membership do not belong to his party. He got only 27 votes for his party. It's one of the lowest supports of the Labour Party in the history of the Labour Party. 27 out of 120. Now with 27, the distance between 27 and 61 is what? I mean, it's enormous. You got 34. So now he has to go out and scrounge 34. But 61 is no good. 61 is fine if you're voting on sewers. But if you're voting on peace, you need 2/3. So now you're not talking about, what, 61? You're talking about somewhere close to 80. So there you are with 27. And now you've got to find enough people, quarreling people, in the parliament to reach 80. So, one of the reasons why you have seen very, very, very little action is, having won the election, the big challenge for Barak is getting something off the ground. And what I want to address after the break is, what can he do? Please come back in 10 minutes. Thank you very, very much. What is and what can Barak do? Because he won the election, and he did create a coalition. So let me try to describe the coalition. The coalition almost reaches 80. Because in order to make peace, he can't do it with 61. He's got to have a large majority. You can't make peace after all these years of war unless you have a large majority. So he has his own party, no longer Labor. Don't use the word Labor anymore. It is now what? Politically incorrect. The word is that a good name? One Israel. Nobody likes two. They all like one. Everything is one. One people, one Reich, one. All right, one Israel. Okay. The second, and he had them in his hands from the very beginning, is the Civil Rights Party, to the left of One Israel, that was organized initially by Shulamit Aloni. And it's called Meretz, and the Meretz Party lost one seat, actually. They had 10, and now they've got 9. So 27 plus 9, all right, gives you 36. You're moving up. And you can always rely on them. Now, Meretz had to make a choice. Meretz said before the election, we will not sit in a government in which the Orthodox are present. The only way to undermine Orthodox power is to kick them out of the government. But you go find 80 without the Orthodox. So, when they were presented with the reality that ultimately Rabin would need the Orthodox, they said, well, you know we are unalterably opposed to this, but you need us in the government. So there, guess what? In the government. It's not wise to make threats unless you're prepared to follow through. And parents know this, right? You've got to be very careful making threats, because if you make threats and you don't follow through, or a teacher, whatever, you're finished. So the credibility of merits is a little, tarnished and so forth. But, the political world, it's not terrible. The third, the Russians divided in two. The leader of the Russians was this famous man. His name was Natan Sharansky. He was the great hero. He was in a Soviet prison for many, many years. He was dramatically freed. And when he arrived in Israel, he was like Solzhenitsyn. Do you understand? He was the great one. And then he decided to enter politics as the leader of the Russians. And now he is hated. I mean, it's very interesting. Once you enter the world of politics and you have to take sides, then you're no longer a saint. Saints don't enter politics. So he's no longer a saint. There are people who still love him, but not as intensely before. And now there are people who despise him. It's interesting. Same thing happened to Solzhenitsyn once he entered into the political world in Russia. When he arrived, he was the what? The saint. And then he opened his mouth, said, this party no, this party, finished. So Sharansky had a party called Yisrael Ba'aliyah, and the Israel coming up to, people coming up to Israel, and a faction broke off because they didn't like the Sharansky leadership. See, the internal battles. But his party supports Barak. Why? Because he wanted to get hold of that Ministry of the Interior which decides who is a Jew. He had formerly been in the government of Bibi Netanyahu, but Netanyahu didn't do anything because he was allied to the Orthodox, and the Orthodox held the Ministry of Interior. So he said to the Netanyahu force, you're not going to help me and my people, I'm going over to the other side. So he went over to the other side, got what he wanted, but meanwhile, he's all caught up in the dirt of what we call politics, changing, exchanging, whatever else it is. His sainthood, the halo, is now disappearing. All right. He picked up Yitzhak Mordechai. Yitzhak Mordechai was the minister of defense in the Netanyahu government. And then he withdrew, and he thought he was going to organize the opposition to Netanyahu. He was a military man with a nicer personality than Barak, plus he was not a European Jew. He was a Sephardic Oriental Jew, and he'd win those votes, and that would be it, except the moment he opened his mouth. It's not that he lacks charisma. And the kindest thing I can say is he's not very smart. Yeah, I mean, you're getting the idea? So the campaign didn't really get off the ground. And in the end, what was he going to do? Just before the election, since he knew he wasn't going to make it as prime minister, he said to the voters, I don't put Netanyahu in power, vote for Barak. So they voted for Barak, so now he's rewarded. And so after all this steam and buildup, where he's going to win a majority, he ends up with 5. 5. Humiliating. Even his wife said to him, aren't you ashamed? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? 5! Okay. All right, so he's crawling toward 8. You see how he's crawling? It's so hard to build a government in parliamentary systems where there are not major political parties that control huge numbers of people. It's this pasting together job. And then the Orthodox, all of whom voted for Netanyahu, and who vowed they would never join a government that was going to enforce the Oslo agreements. Never! They're lining up. Why are they lining up? What's the reason? Well, the answer is very clear. The Orthodox world in Israel survives on government subsidies for its schools. Millions and millions and millions of dollars are given, without the voucher system, are given by the government, do you understand, to the Orthodox. Now, the only way you get the money is that you're in the government. If you leave the government, no money. No money, no schools, close down, shut down operation, resign, never. So the next thing Barak knows is the leader of the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism says, well, I don't like your policies, but we could maybe live. And then the head of the National Religious Party, which has been the strongest force for settlements, he shows up, he says, well, I said a few nasty things about you during the election. But you understand, it's politics, and people say things they don't always believe. And, well, the next thing, who could believe it? They have traipsed over from Netanyahu's side to here, and Barak wants them, because he doesn't want to make peace with all the Orthodox in opposition. And then the big coup was a party that virtually doubled its representation in the Knesset. It's a party of Sephardic Jews who are Orthodox. Many of the people who voted for them weren't Orthodox. They voted for them because they were militantly Sephardic, Oriental, Jews from Western Asia, North Africa, hating the old European establishment. Okay. And they had a leader who had been indicted and convicted of embezzling funds. Very charismatic figure. Aryeh Deri. Why should that interfere with politics, please? So Barak had a problem. He would like the Shas because he would like support from the Sephardic community. Every community has to support the peace process right now because that's very, very important. And so Aryeh Deri shows up, and he says, look, Aryeh, I'd love to have you in the government, but you're a convicted criminal. You're going to have to find another person to head the party. So he runs back to the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who is the saint of the party, and Ovadia Yosef says, he's not a criminal, he's a good man. But Barak says, I respect your rabbi, but you understand, you're a convicted embezzler. So they retired Aryeh Deri, and they found another man, not as charismatic, to be the head of the party, and Shas now joins the government. Ultra-Orthodox. Well, at that point, there's a party that got 6 votes, led by this very, very charismatic TV personality. A man actually in his late 60s who'd come from Hungary, and he hates the Orthodox. He put on all these programs. All his programs were mocking the Orthodox. And he organized a party called Shinui, Change, and the vow was, we are going to break the power of the Orthodox. He got 6 votes. He supported Barak. And Barak was going to count on him. He, of all of it, they were going to count on him in favor of the peace process, in favor of the secularism, break the power of the Orthodox. He was the only man of integrity. He said to Barak, you have betrayed me. You now have all the people who hated you and denounced you in the election are in your government. I, who praised you, do you understand, and supported you with the promise that you wouldn't let the Orthodox into the government, I have been betrayed. He refused to join the government. Is that not interesting? So the party The back Barak is what? They're standing out there, Shinui. And meanwhile, the Orthodox have traipsed into the government offices, and now they say, oh, peace, peace, peace. Of course, we're all for peace, but make sure that our schools get a little money. Now, there was one constituency that supported him in the election. They had a leader who ran for prime minister and at the very end told them to vote, his constituents to vote for Barak. They are the Arabs. And there's a big party called the United Arab List. And the United Arab List came to Barak and said, you know what? We support the peace process and we support your whole program. Why don't you include us in the government? Well, that would add, by the way, for him, close, I mean, like seven or eight votes. He said no, because if he lets the Arabs into the government, the Orthodox will walk out. And he reasoned. In the end, even though they're out of the government, they will still support us because we're for the peace process, so I don't have to give them any ministries, and they can just what? They'll be there. So outside of the coalition are two parties that basically support the peace process, although they're not members of the government. They are the Arabs and Shinui, and when you put them all together, you get something over 80 pasted together. You know how long it took him? It was like a month and a half. What's the government? He pasted it. Now he's got the coalition. Now the coalition hasn't held, by the way. The United Torah Judaism Party left over an issue. A large engineering piece which could only travel the Israeli roads on Saturday when there's very little traffic, was moved on Saturday, the Sabbath. And it had been done all the time because you can't, it's bumper-to-bumper traffic on Israeli roads. Bumper-to-bumper traffic all the time. Only Saturday is it free. So this is an essential part of the system, and so it was being moved on Saturday. And when it was discovered it was being moved, and these things had been moved consistently, even during Netanyahu's time, the United Torah Judaism man now stood up and said, stop. And Barak says, no, it's on its way. We're not stopping this thing. It has to go. And so he withdrew from the government. But he did say the following. Now, I want you to know, Ehud, that's his first name, Barak, that if you need our support on other issues, we're prepared to give it, and don't forget us when you divvy up the money for the schools. Okay. So now this coalition is faced with all the issues. I mean, Barak has to negotiate them all. And they all have to do with the peace issue, which is the main issue now to be negotiated. One, do you recognize that there is a state called Palestine which will ultimately become independent? Two, are you prepared to abandon some of the settlements, since obviously you're not going to have any peace if all the settlements are maintained? The settlements will have to be regrouped in some way. Three, are you or are you not prepared to give up the Jordan Valley? The Jordan Valley is the boundary between Jordan and Israel right now and the West Bank. The Palestinians say that's our boundary between Palestine and Jordan, and the Israelis have said, no, you can have your state inside of Israel, but you can't touch the boundary of any other. Well, what kind of independence is that? There's the whole issue of Hamas, the fundamentalists. That was Netanyahu's always said. You haven't enforced the Oslo Agreement. You haven't gotten rid of the fundamentalists. You haven't tamed them, and we're not going to surrender a piece of land until you do. We want to make sure that every terrorist is arrested. But then The whole issue of Golan. Do you or do you not give up the Golan Heights, which has Jewish settlements on it, in order to make peace with Syria? And then there's the issue of Jerusalem. Do you or do you not allow the Palestinians to have a presence in East Jerusalem and maybe declare it as their capital? I mean, that's the most volatile issue. The refugees. How many refugees do you allow to come back? Anybody who wants to? And then compensation. If they're not coming back, are you going to pay them? They had a house in Haifa. Their house is now occupied by an Israeli, so they get compensated? They're living in Beirut. Now there's a big controversy. The Israeli government is now making a list of all the properties confiscated by Arabs in Arab countries from Jews who were forced to flee after 1948. And they're saying, well, we're going to do an X. If you X off the house in Haifa, we'll X off the house in Baghdad. Got it? But meanwhile, the children of the owners of this property are screaming at the Israelis, are you going to take our house? We want to sue the Iraqi government for compensation that we want. What you're doing is taking our house and using it as a bargaining chip against this. Meanwhile, we don't have access to our own reparations. So it's a very big, it's a very volatile issue. And then you've got the issue of armaments, you see. Do the Palestinians have more guns than they're supposed to have? Well, Netanyahu said, we can't make a peace agreement. You have violated this. You have more guns and more armaments than you're supposed to have, and your police force is too armed. So we're going to count the guns, you're going to have to get rid of some of those guns, and so forth and so on. And then the Palestinians respond, but if we're going to be an independent state, we have to have some kind of respectable police force that might be, in some way, some kind of little respectable army, and that's consistent with the Oslo Agreement. And so the argument goes on and on and on. Let's look at the realities. Ehud Barak is not one of the most charismatic figures in the world. He just arrived. I saw his picture in the New York Times and Detroit Free Press, whatever. He went to Germany. Schroeder, who is the prime minister of Germany, has decided, since they just moved back to Berlin, to soften the blow. The first foreign leader he has welcomed to Berlin is the Israeli prime minister, to say it's all right because, and then he went off to Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp, with Ehud Barak. So there's the picture of Ehud Barak. Have you ever seen a picture of Ehud Barak smiling? Have you? I've been looking vainly. I go through all these newspapers, periodicals. Ooh, there must be a picture with him with a smile. Never. Charismatic, he's not. Mobilizing, what? He's not. Smart, he is. And he tends to function as the commander of an army. He's a loner. He doesn't share with other people what he intends to do. He just springs it on them. Arafat now, at his age, just lost his wife. She left him. He married this woman about, yeah, right, she's about 35 years younger than he, and they had this baby, and she's a feminist, and she couldn't take it. So she left. And is he depressed? I don't know. It's difficult. Interviews have not indicated what his emotional state is at this time. But Arafat wants to be the president of an independent Palestine, and it's very clear he's prepared to be as conciliatory as necessary. 3, American pressure continues. It will not stop. Madeleine Albright shows up, and she reminds the Israelis as well as the Palestinians, we got to have peace. We know that Mr. Assad in Syria is interested. He wants to get back the Golan Heights. He knows that Israel is here to stay. So now he's open to negotiations. The issue is, can you negotiate? He has a weak heart, and he wants to make sure that his son succeeds him. So he'd like to make peace with Israel before he dies. So there's this possibility. The Orthodox in Israel are now tamed. You can see why they're tamed. They're trapped between two goals. What has tamed them is their need for money. So their need for money for their schools has now forced them to accept a peace process that they used to what? Scream at. They'll still scream a little, but on the whole, if they're given a choice, it's very clear what their choices are. The nationalists are tamed. Those were the people who were the head of the Likud party, the Arik Sharon, who has now been chosen as the leader of the Likud party, replacing Bibi Netanyahu. Don't give an inch, will never surrender a piece of territory. They're tamed. Because it's very clear from the election, the Israelis have accepted the peace process. So what's going to happen? I mean, this whole party was built around what? Rejecting the peace process. And now what's the agenda of this party when the peace process has been accepted? One of the realities is all those secularists who thought that by supporting Barak they would break the power of the Orthodox, they failed. Who's in the government? The Orthodox. And where is the chief secularist party? On the outs, supporting the government on peace, but on the outs. They don't have the Ministry of Education. Although a member of the Meretz party now does have control, Yossi Sarid, of that ministry. Terrorism, it's basically failed. Terrorism has not stopped the peace process. There have been moments when politicians have tried to exploit it to stop it, but it what? It hasn't stopped it. The last two incidents, two people were blown up who were trying to make bombs. One was in Haifa, and so one of the realities is, and you can see it, Israel is prepared to recognize Palestine ultimately as an independent state. And Palestine is obviously ready to accept publicly Israel as a legitimate state. We're moving toward that. And what is very interesting is the declining power of fundamentalism here. The fundamentalists have not been able to prevent the what? The peace process. Hamas is not as strong as it was, and the most interesting thing that happened was two of the most militant Palestinian leaders, Chabash and Awatmeh, who were in Damascus, Syria, and they railed against Arafat for his surrender. They show up, because Mr. Assad told them to. He's basically kicked them out of Damascus. And they now show up, and it's kiss, kiss, kiss with Arafat. They accept the peace process. But don't surrender too much. So you can see what's happening. In Algeria now, there is a peace being established between the secular government and the fundamentalists. In Iran, there's a very, very strong faction of people opposed to extreme fundamentalism. Fundamentalism won't go away. You'll have your Omar bin Ladens, but their ability to interrupt the process, the political process toward peace has been limited. What's the implications of all of this? Well, the election of Ehud Barak and the fall of communism are a turning point in the whole process. What it means is the peace process is on the move. That will mean that there will be some kind of state called Palestine, very small, itsy bitsy, composed of Gaza and some part of the West Bank. It will mean that Israel will revert to other boundaries from before. Not exactly what they were in 1967. There'll be a few additions. But on the whole, it will be a smaller Israel. One of the implications is that Israeli politics is going to be redefined. If the peace process continues, then the Conservative Party, whose major plank was opposition to the peace, isn't going to have a plank. That is, it may be that Israeli politics will revolve around the secularist fundamentalist issue, and that people will have to redefine themselves accordingly. The conservative parties will indeed be the orthodox parties, but the orthodox parties are trapped by the fact that they need to be in the government in order to get their money. One of the implications is that those people in Israel who are hoping to ultimately break orthodox power, the reform, the conservative, the secularists, whatever, are plenty frustrated. Because given the birth rate and given the political situation in Israel, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to form any government without including some part of the Orthodox. That will be the future in Israel. It means that they will no longer have the power to stop the peace process, but they will continue to be intrusive in Israeli life because that's what the numbers, do you understand? That's what the numbers seem to indicate. And most likely what we'll have for the future, if Israel can establish peace, then she's going to be accepted by many countries in the third world. Those are the countries with whom she needs to do business. And that was beginning before Netanyahu came to power, and it can be resumed. And last, and very important, so now I wish to articulate it, since we're in the United States of America, on the border of Canada, but in America. Okay. One of the implications of this whole thing, because American pressure has been instrumental in arranging for it, is that America, despite all its problems and weaknesses and whatever, remains the only functioning manager of whatever world order there is. That's it. And Pat Buchanan may say, we don't want to do it and don't do it. No, I don't care. Get lost, Pat. Okay. In the end, a very important element in the peace process is the United States of America, its vested interests, and its role now as the hegemonic power in the world. And we can't retire from that job because somebody has to be in that job. We may hate the job, but somebody has to do that job. And in fact, what Israel has to live with, and East Timor has to live with, and Indonesia has to live with, do you understand? And Serbia has to live with, is that ultimately they cannot overwhelmingly defy the team that America puts together to maintain whatever their vision is of law and order in the world. So I want to end by saying, and certainly with the arrival of the Australians in East Timor and what's happened in the Middle East with the peace process, I'm proud to be American. So. And that intervention has been, for me, a very, very appropriate kind of thing, and I thank you very, very much for your attention.